This is the Chapter 3 Stigma Podcast. This podcast was created to be there for any individual who feels like they are at a low point in life and are confused, seemingly alone, and helpless in their situation. I am a recovering alcoholic, and I felt this way too, until I sat across the table from another addict who shared his story and made me realize that I was not alone in my struggles. My life was saved by this realization, and I hope to help anyone struggling by sharing my story to show you that you are not alone and that life can contain unbelievable riches and meaning. Welcome. I am glad you are here. Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Chapter 3 Stigma Podcast. In this episode, we are going to continue on in discussing the rehab experience. And so, again, my reason for wanting to focus in on this topic in particular is one of the most frequent questions that I get from folks who are following along or have heard my story and engaged with me is, do I need to go to rehab? And secondly, what is the rehab experience like? Obviously, for those of you who have never been, it's really hard to even contemplate what 28 days essentially removed from the world to focus on yourself could even entail. And so what I've done for this episode, and I am very certain it will be less heavy and emotional than the last episode, is I've extracted some of the key exercises that we did, both between group activities and individual activities. And I just kind of wanted to play out sort of the arc of healing that rehab can allow you to do if you really commit to it and put the work in it, and kind of to show some structure to the process and the model that is used for entering someone into a life of recovery. And so you'll probably hear some papers shuffling around here in the background as I maneuver through the big binder that they gave us upon entering rehab. So we all carried around a binder. It essentially had our daily plan listed out for each day of the week, which, while largely was the same, had a few nuance to each day of the week. Largely speaking, though, we would spend at least 3 hours in each morning and afternoon session in some sort of group setting. And a lot of this was like group therapy based. Sometimes we did activities such as yoga or mindfulness meditation. But seeing as I had absolutely no idea what to expect going into this type of programming, I just wanted to detail out some of these exercises and just really drive at the value. And again, maybe give someone listening out there an avenue to start themselves down the path of recovery. You don't have to go to rehab to execute on some of these exercises and to take it upon yourself to start doing the work. So in a big way, I wanted to share that for that reason alone. The first exercise that I'm going to start here with, and I will specifically call out like whether these were done in group settings, how we executed them, and ultimately the value and the outcome that I saw from these various exercises. But the first one that I will detail here is an individual exercise. So it was a group setting where we were handed this write-up, and the topic of conversation was consequences. So consequences stemming from our addiction, stemming from our behavior, and basically what they did was give us a long list of categories to think about within our own lives where consequences could have occurred. And then what we were prompted to do was go through the list and highlight the ones that really stand out to you as being like obviously impactful in your own life. And then to write out some detail pertaining to how those consequences manifested in your life. And this was one of the early exercises that I did. And again, I would say this was one of the more impactful ones, just to put on paper and see all of the ramifications that were stemming specifically from the root cause of my behavior and my addiction. And it just really actually provided a lot of motivation and a lot of obvious improvements that could happen in your life should you choose to pursue a life in recovery. So just to go through some of the high level consequences that I personally picked out, and I'll selectively here and there like dive into the actual write-up that I did for them. So the first one, problems in my key relationship. So I called out the consequence. Alyssa and I would get in arguments at night. We would spend all of the time during Grant's nap talking about and trying to mend our relationship after I would go on a bender. And I would feel incredibly frustrated, angry, and just want the conversations to stop. Second consequence, putting my family's well-being at risk. Third consequence, loss of dreams and goals in my life. The call out I had here was I used to have a vision for my life, and I would set goals every 6 or so weeks. As of now, I felt, before checking into rehab, I felt incredibly unmotivated and undirected in my life because I did not have goals. Fourth consequence was isolation. Fifth consequence, feelings of hopelessness or worthlessness. The write-up I had there, I feel that nothing is going well with work, my personal life, or with my house, my home. I began feeling depressed and started viewing the world in a negative light. Sixth consequence, depression. Seventh consequence, loss of self-esteem. Eighth, intense feelings of shame and guilt. Ninth, continuing destructive behavior despite the health risks. I'm going to read this one because in the closing weeks and months of my time drinking, I had, and I'll get to the writing right now, fear of long-term liver, brain, and internal damage. I feel fear when I'm sober, but live like I'm purposefully slowly killing myself when I'm drinking. I would have instances when I was detoxing where I would just tell Alyssa, I feel like I'm dying. I feel like I'm wasting away. And this one really stood out to me because I have always kind of put my own personal health and well-being as a high priority for me, and I was clearly degrading it through my drinking. 10th consequence, causing physical harm to myself. The write-up portion, getting so angry at myself that I would scream, yell, and slap and punch myself. So I think I've admitted to that here on the podcast before, but it's really hard to talk about. But I would be incredibly self-abusive to myself, give myself black eyes that I would have to explain away with work and with friends at the gym and things like that. 11th, loss of faith in God or your higher power. And I just wrote, I feel there is no real purpose in life. I'm lashing out at the world. It makes me feel small. 12, not being productive at work. 13, wasting of our money. 14, legal issues. And 15, loss of interest in hobbies. So again, that exercise really just put into perspective. It was not hard for me to just like whip these out. And if you have any interest in doing this type of consequences exercise, I would just go ahead and Google like lists of consequences from drinking or lists of consequences from addiction, and then use that list as a prompt, not feeling that you have to apply every single consequence or scenario to your life, but pull out and extract the ones that resonate with you the most, and then write in detail how they're actually manifesting in your life. It is surprising how quickly you can lose sight of the impacts of your decisions and your behaviors, and this exercise really helps play it out. Another exercise that was individual in nature, very similar to the obituary exercise, was called our Dear Alcohol, or I called it the Dear Alcohol breakup letter. So you essentially wrote a letter as if your drug of choice was a person that you were in a relationship with and you were breaking up with them, like for good, for the rest of your life. And so I, spent time writing 2 pages out, and again, just really realized and felt empowered about all of the fears that I had that ultimately led to drinking weren't actually in all reality affecting me anymore. And I just kind of reasoned out in that letter all of the basically like data points as to like why I don't need alcohol in my life anymore. The next exercise that I'm going to call out, it is a handout, and I'm going to talk through it. I think it's pretty simple to talk through the visual, but essentially this topic that we covered in a group therapy session was the groundwork for the entirety of the programming that I went through at my inpatient rehab facility. So this this handout was titled Becoming Psychologically Flexible. And so it details like flexibility is the ability to adapt to life's difficulties while remaining true to one's values. And so there's the majority of this page is a visual, and in the center it says psychological flexibility. And then there are components listed. There are 6 components listed around that statement in a circular fashion. And those components are acceptance, 2nd, detachment from thoughts, 3rd, present focus perspective, 4th, observing self, 5th, values creation, 6th, values enactment. And just in going back and looking at this visual, as I said before, the entirety of our programming was really built around these concepts. You could bucket every single thing that we did into building up our skill set around one of these components. And so then with that in mind, I'm going to go further into some of the actual exercises that we went through. The first is one of the more dynamic and interesting group therapy exercises that we did. And I wanted to call it out in particular because of its the value that it has in a group setting. Again, prior to going into rehab, I had no idea what to expect out of group therapy. I didn't understand the value. I couldn't see how my problems and issues could be solved sitting in a room and talking with 15 to 20 other individuals. But this exercise really unlocked a lot for me and showed me the value that a group therapy session could take. And what this exercise was a handout, and it was just titled My Strengths and Qualities. And the directions that were given, there are categories listed on the page. So as an example, 2 of them are things I am good at, and then listed out 1, 2, 3. Compliments I have received, listed out 1, 2, 3, where those items are blank. The directions was you as an individual took 5 minutes to fill out all of these prompts, and there were 8 in total. And then what we did was you put your name on the top of the piece of paper, and you pass your paper to the left. The person that received your piece of paper had to add in a trait or strength or quality that you had that did not exist on the sheet at that point. And then you were passed the person's paper that was sitting to your right, and you did the same for them. So this process repeated until your piece of paper came back around and got to you. And I took a few very meaningful kind of like outputs from this exercise. One was that I largely degraded and downplayed aspects of my personality and myself that other people really valued and appreciated. And the second part of it is those qualities and aspects of myself that I really dislike and hate, other people aren't paying attention to. And it made me realize, like, other people don't care about your perceived like weaknesses as much as you really believe that they might. And so this one was extremely beneficial. And honestly, just from a group dynamic perspective, this exercise alone, I remember distinctly like unlocking a lot of openness and kind of like looseness within our group after we did it, because it was like we were all forced to sort of say and highlight something nice about each other. But then in the hours after and days after, it's like we kind of didn't lose sight of that view of everyone else in our group. And so it was a really, really powerful exercise, both from the individual and the group perspective. The next exercise that I'll touch on quick is a huge list of values that we were just challenged to go through. Again, we kind of talked through things from the standpoint of a group exercise and introduction. And then we were instructed as individuals to go through and, circle the values that really stood out to you the most, the ones that you have, that you believe you have, the ones that you desire, and then star the ones that are the most imperative to you. I guess just to play this one out, the ones that I ultimately have starred, and this is a list of 60 plus values. The ones I wound up starred were adventure, humility, nature, parenting, truth, and then I flagged self-respect as one I desired. Another group exercise that we did that kind of morphed into an individual exercise was discussing cognitive distortions. And again, circling back to that concept of psychologically flexible or building psychological flexibility, the cognitive distortions concept really falls out under sort of like your thought process and your observation of yourself. And so this is a deep dive into some of the most common cognitive distortions. And I'm not going to read through every single one. What I'm going to do is highlight the ones that I highlighted as being most present in my life. So if you're curious for more and for a list of distortions that might apply in your life, again, I would just Google cognitive distortions and addiction. So the ones that manifested most greatly in my life were all or nothing thinking, which is also known as polarized thinking, also known as black and white thinking. It manifests as an inability or unwillingness to see shades of gray. In other words, you see things in terms of extremes. Something is either fantastic or awful. You are either perfect or a total failure. This one in particular made me realize how much I use the words always and never in my life. And one of the real challenges that I've given myself in the months and years after leaving rehab now at this point is to remove always and never from my vocabulary as much as possible. I'm not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I do try, and that stems directly from this exercise. The next one that I highlighted, jumping to conclusions or fortune telling. So this refers to the tendency to make conclusions and predictions based on little to no evidence and holding them as gospel truth. One example is, I'm going to skip that example. And really for me, it was like I would receive one piece of criticism or like bad news, say on the work front, and I would literally jump to like, my God, I'm going to get fired. There's no future with me here in this team or with this organization. The next cognitive distortion, magnification or minimization. This is a stealthy skewing of your perspective. This involves exaggerating the importance or meaning of things or minimizing the importance or meaning of things. An athlete who is generally a good player but makes a mistake may magnify the importance of that mistake and believe that he is a terrible teammate, while an athlete who wins a coveted award in her sport may minimize the importance of the award and continue believing she is only a mediocre player. For me, really, this was like the tendency that I viewed any like perceived success. I downplayed any perceived like success or improvement, like personal improvement, genuine personal improvement. And I just like solely focused on the shortcomings in my case. And then finally, the last distortion I have is always being right. So perfectionists and those struggling with imposter syndrome will recognize this distortion. It is a belief that we must always be right, correct, or accurate. And on and on. Just like I could not be wrong. Yet I extolled humility as one of my key values. So, square the circle on that one for me. So again, those cognitive distortions really played key into this concept of being psychologically flexible. Next up, in a similar exercise to the distortions one, was defense mechanisms. So these are psychological techniques that people use to keep them from fully experiencing the reality of their situation. There's strategies used for coping with reality, for maintaining a certain self-image, and for reducing emotional or psychological distress. Again, we were handed this big write-up, and we went through it then at the individual level. It just really highlighted the ones that felt like they resonated in our lives the most. Additionally, with this exercise, we took it one step further, and we actually wrote out the examples of how these manifest in our life. And so all of these, I guess what I'll do is just read through the defense mechanism. So first is projection, next rationalization, third intellectualization. So this one I will pause just because it cracks me up in rereading it. The example of how this manifested in my life was what I would tell myself, quote, "I'm not an alcoholic, I have depression." And just all the yarns that I wove for myself, spinning around and around the word and the acceptance of alcoholism and trying to find any intellectual like backflip that I could do to distance myself from that word. Anyway, next one, minimization. Next, denial. 6, blaming. 7, suppression. 8, avoidance. 9, deflection. 10, manipulation, which I will say myself and other alcoholics are absolute experts at. 11 is hostility, and 12 is lying. And so on hostility, how I would use that as a defense mechanism, just because this one is like really blatant and obvious. I would get pissed off at work and like make a big scene to my loved ones about how terrible work was to avoid the topic of my drinking and like the anxiety and the depression that I was bringing upon myself with my drinking. All right, just a few left. The next one I'm going to just kind of call out. It was a role-playing exercise. So again, this is something that we did in group, but we broke up into small, just small partners. It's just you and another person. And you were detailed a scenario, and there are, there are 10 scenarios on here, so it looks like we got through about like 4 or 5. But anyway, these were really interesting role plays to execute, because basically the way they worked it out is they laid out the scenario and then assigned each person a responsible role to take. And so just detailing this one, scenario 2, dealing with stress. Person A has a particularly stressful day at work and feels the urge to use as a means of coping. Person B, acting as a supportive friend, engages person A in a conversation, helping them to apply stress management and emotional regulation techniques instead of resorting to substance use. And so what this sort of setup requires you to do is, like, all of us in rehab were person A. Like, we were going to leave rehab and we were going to encounter situations that person A is being faced with in this exercise. However, all of us had to play the role of the opposite, basically, and work to convince the other person, who was really us at the end of the day, about like how to avoid these situations or just deal with them and accept them. And so it put you in this state where you sort of had to frame up the argument and the reasoning and justification for this scenario that you were guaranteed to face after the fact. Some of the other scenarios were conflict resolution, handling negative emotion, facing triggers, refusal skills, like if you got offered a drink at a party, coping with loneliness, handling success, facing anxiety, coping with grief. Geez, sorry, I haven't revisited that since rehab. I feel like I could write a book on that last one at this point. Anyway, moving on. The second to last exercise that we did here is actually one of the thicker and longer work sheets that we did. And it was a wellness assessment, which was super interesting to do. So it had a manner in which you scored wellness across 8 different dimensions in your life. And what this really allowed you to do was assess where you need to focus your efforts in the remaining time in rehab, but also in your time shortly after discharge. And so this wellness assessment would play a part in your rehab discharge plan, which I'm going to spend a whole podcast episode talking about next. But the dimensions of the wellness exam were the following: emotional, financial, social, spiritual, occupational, physical, intellectual, environmental. And just to highlight my outcomes, my lowest scores were occupational, emotional, and intellectual. How these wound up impacting my discharge plan and my recovery plan after discharging from rehab was, I actually I haven't really shared this a lot or told a lot of people, but I gave myself 6 weeks to go back to work. I was entirely discontent with my work and team and occupation at the time that I went into rehab. And I set myself a 6-week mark where if I went back to work and the triggers, the emotional toll, the stress was unchanged and felt like it was too much for me to sustain my recovery journey, I was going to quit. I did not need another job lined up at that time. We had assessed our financial situation. We figured we had the runway to do it, and it was not worth risking my recovery for a job that, quite frankly, I didn't care all that much for. And so I set this 6-week timer for myself. The other example of how this played out with regards to emotional wellness, which was another hugely low score for me, was this way. So the things that I would like to do that I called out was continuing to practice identifying and expressing emotions, and then being open and honest with friends And basically what I meant by that was I was making a bit of a commitment not to really hide or shy away from talking about my alcoholism and addiction issues. All right, and then finally, the last exercise that I pulled out, and obviously this is not the extent of them all, but this is kind of the highlight of the ones that were most impactful for me, and also I think flow kind of well together and show the progression of how you build and layer upon these skills. This exercise was called Mapping Solutions to Stress. So all of us, again, the way these kind of play out in the group setting is you get a handout, you kind of talk through high level what the topic is today. So again, managing, mapping solutions to stress. And then we broke up and did a individual assessment here. So all of us had to select a current stressor that we had in our lives. The one that I chose was going back to work. So this was close to the end of my time in rehab. I had to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 where I sat at with that stressor. I actually rated myself at a 4. I was fairly low stress about going back to work because of what I said earlier. I had, to myself, made a commitment that I was going to walk away from work if things weren't going well after 6 weeks. And once I made that commitment to myself and had that realization that work wasn't something that I needed, that this particular job wasn't something that I absolutely needed in my life, it relieved a ton of stress. And then the next prompt, there's 3 columns. It's what are you doing to cope with the stress? The second prompt was what's worked in the past to help you deal with stress? And the third is what's one thing you could do to lower your stress by 1 point on the scale? The only thing I want to call out here is I broke up the second prompt, what's worked in the past to help you deal with stress, into a then, pre-rehab, and then a now. So the then, the way I handled the stress, the acute stress, I should say, is alcohol, and I pent up my frustration. And then the way I wanted to handle stress now was write things down, talk about the stressors, exercise, and continue going to my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu class and gym. It's kind of cool. Some of these handouts are a little cheesy. I will be the first one to admit that. But they had a health check in here for stress reduction. And I actually thought it went above and beyond, both in terms of its simplicity, but actually now based on my experience, how accurate it is and what how they laid it out, I think is not normally how you see these things presented in common health forums, although I think the tide is shifting there. So there are 4 things to this health check for stress reduction. 1, sleep and rest. 2, nutrition. 3, exercise. 4, relax and have fun. The final thing that they have on here is just don't forget to laugh. So anyway, I really actually appreciated this little visual that they put together because I think some of these things are often overlooked. I'm trying to figure out between the newsletter or the podcast where to potentially cover this, but I do, given my time now in AA, I do have some call it critiques or common criticisms of the program. One of the ones that I hold closest to me and take most personally is the lack of acknowledgement that nutrition and exercise play in someone's recovery journey. So the fact that it's called out on here on the worksheet for managing stress, I think means a lot. So again, that's all I've got. There's kind of the high level coverage of some of the key group and individual activities that we did. Again, the ebbs and flows of everyone's rehab experience is going to differ based on the location, the exact program that the center runs, even the people involved. I was so blessed that the group that I was a part of was just entirely focused on their own recovery journey, but then also protecting everyone else's recovery journey. So that's all I've got for this week. Thank you all for following along.
If you enjoyed this podcast, share it with others or give us a rating on your channel of choice. My hope is that my story can help others in their struggles with addiction or any other aspects of life that they feel could be bettered. You can follow us on social media at Chapter 3 Stigma on Instagram and YouTube. I cannot solve your problems for you, but I can listen. If you want to reach out with a message through one of those channels, I will respond and let you know that you are not alone. All the best, you are loved, and life is worth every struggle and bit of suffering you have to endure. Until next time, all the best.